October 30th, 1974, and I'm interviewing Rabbi Eugene Lipman, Washington, D.C. First of all, I'd like to ask you some background information very quickly. When did you first go over to Europe as a chaplain?
April 1945.
April 1945. And this is the period that we wanted to discuss, which you haven't really spent much time on in the past. Is that correct?
I don't know. As I don't know which period I've spent much time on, not time on,
Okay.
in the previous recordings.
Oh, I see.
I can't give you the relative emphasis in those I don't remember.
Okay. In any event, I'm interested in the type of information that you may have passed on by yourself to American Jewry about the entire DP situation. In other words, when you got there, first of all, when was your first encounter, and did you feel that there was a need to convey this to American Jewry?
My first encounter with displaced persons was on VE Day itself. We were in Belgium, preparatory to going back into Germany, and in the VE celebration in Verviers, I ran into some Jews from Buchenwald. That was my first contact. I didn't think in terms of American Jewry. I did have a need to convey this to my family and to my close associates in the United States. I did that in a series of letters which I wrote, which my wife distributed. I wrote her V-letters and she distributed them here and there, wherever necessary, as I wrote them. You have to keep in mind the fact that there were between 90 and 100 Jewish chaplains in the European theater at that point, and all except one of us was deeply involved with displaced persons, and all having similar experiences, though not identical experiences, and therefore we all wrote. And American Jewry got information that way. I don't think anybody could take on himself the right to be the informant of American Jewry. But I started to write immediately, and I wrote letters almost daily the whole time I was overseas.
Do you have samples of those letters?
Yes, I have some of them, yeah.
Okay. Now, I know that you were very critical of the JWB during the early phases for lack of material that they were sending.
No, I was critical of the JDC. The JWB had nothing to do with this. The only function of the Jewish Welfare Board was to supply chaplains with chaplain materials. Lord knows we had enough mezuzahs to go around. What I was interested in was clothing. I was interested in supplementary food, since UNRWA was providing a minimum and really not particularly good diet. I was interested in those things which Jews needed to function. And it was JDC that I held responsible for this. And yes, I was very critical. The first JDC people didn't come into Germany until August of 1945, and they brought nothing, because they had nothing. JDC supplies didn't start coming in until the beginning of 1946. And I thought that was most unfortunate, and said so in many, many ways to many, many people.
What do you think the reasons for that?
I have no way of knowing that. I am not an analyst of JDC or its history. I wasn't here in the United States at the time. I don't know what their problems might have been with the military or with UNRWA, to whom they were seconded. They were under UNRWA jurisdiction. I just know that we didn't get the stuff. It seems to me it could have been bought in Europe. I was able to buy stuff in Europe when I needed it. We bought stuff in North Africa. We bought stuff in Northern Europe. They didn't. That's what matters to me.
Did you ask JDC for funds to be able to buy?
Yes. We asked for funds and we asked for them to buy. We got very little help out of the European office in Paris, which rather took the position that chaplains ought to keep out of this stuff, that they were, after all, the experts, and they would do things their way in their time. Later, let it be said, some JDC people did very good things with displaced persons, and with the thing that I got most concerned with was Aliyah Bet. Mm-hmm. Some of the JDC people worked very well with us, especially in the Munich office.
Mm-hmm. I don't want to go over the things that you may have said before.
I won't even remember what I said before, so you just keep going.
Okay, well then could we be a little more specific about,
Who in the JDC in particular were you talking about that was very helpful to you?
Oh, you're now taxing a bedraggled memory. The JDC people who were most helpful were not the top people. They were the workers themselves. Seal Weinberg, who later became Baruch, who has since died, was an heroic figure in Europe during this period. And she stayed over for years. Well, she was one of those people who arrived first, and she really cared about these Jews. And her time, her energies, her own money. And she would scrounge, and she would steal, and she would do the things that needed to be done for the Jews in the Munich area, and she stayed for many, many years, and she continued to work that way. Another person who died, Rebecca Liebenson, I guess her last name was, who died in Germany in a tragic accident, who was deeply concerned and did everything necessary, legal and translegal. One of the things that ought to be said, and said most clearly, is that anybody who worked within the law in 1945 and 6 with Jewish displaced persons didn't do a job. If you needed to be legal, you weren't going to be effective. And the JDC people and the chaplains and the UNRWA people, Jews and non-Jews, who really served, were people who didn't care about army regulations or unregulated regulations, who only cared about people and did what needed to be done. For example, in Pilsen, where I worked for a number of months, the two important groupings were, of all things, the Red Cross and UNRWA. The Red Cross because a marvelous Jewish woman, whom you should interview incidentally, Sylvia Newlander, was director of the Red Cross Club. And her job was to serve donuts to GIs and see that they got lots of jazz music and a place to sit around and gab. But she organized the underground movement out of Czechoslovakia. We used an UNRWA camp, Camp Karlov, outside Pilsen as a transit station for hundreds of Jews at a time.
Could we be more specific? How did it develop, and how did it transpire?
What is it?
How did this underground?
Oh, because Sylvia came into Pilsen, followed by me, and the two of us.
At what year?
This is 45, right after liberation. I came there in June, and she was there already.
All right, so
she had made contact with the Jewish Brigade, which was in Treviso, Italy at the time. A man named Choter Yishai had come into Germany, had made contact with her, had told her where people could be gotten to in Austria, where his trucks would come into Austria to pick them up. Sylvia was determined to do this. I came in, the two of us got started. We faked papers. I was able to go to Prague and Theresienstadt with my international pass, and I used to go to Prague and Theresienstadt, taking the papers there. The people used to come across to Pilsen. The UNRWA camp train from Prague. There was a train, and as long as you had papers, you could get through, and we faked the papers.
Now, could have someone else have taken your place? In other words, being a chaplain was a very unique position.
Yes. I think only a chaplain could have done what I was able to do, because I could get to the Jews, and I could travel freely. There's something about the chaplain aura. We're considered safe, we're harmless, and we could go where nobody else could go. After, incidentally, the Cold War began in the summer of 45, I had to go illegally into the Russian zone, which means Prague and Theresienstadt, because my international pass was canceled. But by that time we had back roads, and we were able to get through with no trouble. So we just continued doing what we had been doing. A guy named Dunn, a good Scotsman from my hometown of Pittsburgh, was the director of the UNRWA camp at Pilsen, and his deputy was a woman named Green, Faye Green. And they understood Jewish displaced persons and the needs and the uniqueness of the Jewish displaced persons, so they gave us beds in the Karlov camp, no questions asked. We didn't register our people in, we didn't register them out. That's where they were able to stay until our trucks were ready to take them to Austria.
How'd you get trucks?
I used U.S. Army trucks.
How was this accomplished?
Well, because the sergeant in our motor pool was named Katz. It was just about that simple. And we faked trip tickets, and we managed. So we had transports going regularly from Pilsen to Austria. The big problem was getting across the Danube, and we found a dam, which was wide enough for an American 6x to go over. There were no bridges.
What is a 6x?
6x6 is a truck.
Oh, truck.
It's a 2.5-ton truck.
Uh-huh.
And that's what we used for transport. Now, from Czechoslovakia to Austria, that continued for a long time, until I was caught one day and then transferred back into Germany, and we went on to a different route.
How did that work?
I just got caught with a transport in Austria.
They didn't want to hold you for anything?
Well, the officer who interviewed me informed me that he was going to send a report to my commanding general recommending court-martial. But my commanding general decided not to court-martial me. He merely transferred me into back to Germany to a different outfit. That's all.
Who was the commanding general?
Lieutenant General Hubner, the famous Clarence Hubner, known far and wide as the Little Patton. But and I think Miss Newlander had something to do with that. She and the general had gotten rather friendly, and
So the Army was sympathetic.
the Army was either openly sympathetic or anxious to get rid of Jewish displaced persons. You have to understand that of all the displaced persons there were, the Jews were the pain in the neck, because they weren't going to go home, and they weren't easy to deal with. And they made a lot of noise. They were a lot of trouble. And we continued to see to it that they made a lot of noise and were a lot of trouble.
Mm-hmm.
So that from the standpoint of the Army, every Jewish displaced person who got out of Germany, no matter how he got out, was a pleasure for the Army. And so they didn't get in our way. Sometimes they actively cooperated.
Do you have any specific examples of that?
Yeah. One very important one later. But at the very beginning, in order to pay the drivers of these trucks, who were American soldiers, who were, after all, risking court-martial by taking illegal trips that they knew were illegal, we paid them in scotch, because scotch was a precious commodity. Well, field-grade officers, which means majors and up, had almost unlimited scotch available to them. And my senior chaplain, who was a teetotaling Presbyterian from Kansas, took every bottle of scotch he could get his hands on and gave it to me to use for this. He knew what I was doing.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember his
And
name?
no, I'm sorry. I have it recorded somewhere, but he's long since dead. He died in the early 50s. He was an older man, a reserve chaplain from a little town in Kansas who had come on active duty, and I'll think of his name eventually, I suppose. He was wonderful. He let me go. He validated my own trip tickets when he knew darn well that I wasn't on Army business, as it were. He was very helpful. The general himself was very helpful. For example, General Hubner sent Miss Newlander and me to the Zionist Congress in London in the summer of 1945, saying, got to figure out some way to get rid of those Jews, and if those people in London are going to help get rid of those Jews, I'm for it, go. And he flew us to London in his plane so we could go to this meeting. He obviously was interested, for whatever reason, in the Jews. Now, later this went to the highest levels. It's known that General Eisenhower made a deal with Ben-Gurion to cooperate in seeing to it the Jews got out of Germany, so long as American soldiers weren't corrupted in the process. And I flew twice to Jerusalem on a B-17 to bring back into Germany the first Haganah people who came as teachers in the camps and as workers in the camps on behalf of the Jewish Agency, which was the front. But Eisenhower knew what he was doing. He knew exactly what he was doing. And eventually we had 130 Palestinians working in the camps, organizing the bricha, organizing the transports out of Germany.
Could this have been accomplished without the help that you got, without a chaplain again?
What do you mean, without a person like me?
Yeah.
There had to be some Americans in it.
Mm-hmm.
It could have been done without Eisenhower. It could have been done without General Smith, who was very helpful to us.
Yeah.
It could have been done without General Clay, who loved it. There was something about this that appealed to General Clay when he became the commanding general.
Is it worth
He
speaking to
enjoyed
him?
it. Yeah. If he could, I don't know how good his memory is, but
In particular, what would be worthwhile speaking?
ask General Clay for his memories of Dr. Hoffman, and I'll tell you who Dr. Hoffman was. Mr. Retter. I'll tell you who Mr. Retter was. And see what he says. I don't know how good his memory is. Maybe he kept a journal. I didn't. I was afraid to keep a journal. The General Clay may have kept a journal, and he might have some transcripts of meetings with these people. Dr. Hoffman was Chaim Yachiel, whose name was Hoffman. And he was our boss in the American zone of Germany. Retter was a displaced person who was the general secretary of the Central Committee of the Displaced Jews in the American zone of Germany. He is now Aryeh Nesher, N-E-S-H-E-R, vice president of Haifa University, who's in the United States at the moment, and you ought to talk to him. You can reach him through the UJ in New York. He's fascinating, and he has an excellent, much better than mine.
Again, he should be spoken to
About Clay, and about McNarney, and about who did what to whom and with what during this time, because he was the foreign secretary of the Jewish DPs. He represented them in all diplomatic negotiations with Americans, and he has a lot of memories. Yeah, we could have gotten Jews out of Germany without the help of the Americans, but it was a hell of a lot easier.
No, but I'm saying I'm
With-
trying to find out whether your position as a chaplain was
Me?
indispensable, or I mean, a Jewish
It was
chaplain.
important. It was
Could the
important.
JDC have done the same job?
No, because they didn't have the freedom of movement that I had. They didn't have the freedom of movement that Abe Klausner had. I don't know whether you've talked to Abe or not, but you should. They didn't have the freedom of movement of some of the other chaplains. If you can get to Geneva, you certainly ought to talk to Max Browne.
That's right.
And here was Max, who was a lieutenant colonel, and had a great deal of freedom to move, and used it. The only chaplains were the freest people in the military. Nobody knew what the hell we were there for. Nobody knew what we were supposed to be doing. You're praying for troops. So as long as there's a Shabbos service for the Jewish troops didn't need chaplains very much after the war was over. During the war, we were busy. But after the war was over, American troops knew how to take care of themselves. They didn't need a lot of chaplain service. And we were free. And we could go. I was able to deal with 31 camps and communities in North Bavaria for almost a year. I took care of their mail. I took care of their packages. We had a whole system going. Because I had time. Yeah, we can go into that. Now, let me be a little bit systematic. We're jumping around
Sorry.
because you wanted to. Let me finish up Czechoslovakia,
Okay. go ahead.
then move into
Sorry.
Bavaria.
Good. Okay.
All we did in Czechoslovakia, with Sylvia doing the bossing and me doing the running, was get an organized movement going to get Jews from Prague to Pilsen to Austria. And there the Jewish Brigade sent its trucks over the mountains and moved them into Italy, or took them over the hills through Bavaria, where we had some rest stations and we owned some cabins up in the hills. And that worked. It worked very well. Even though I got picked up once and moved back to Germany, it continued to function. It stopped, I don't remember, well, I know it stopped. It stopped when the communists took over Czechoslovakia. Everybody got too scared long about that. That is when the civil government of Czechoslovakia became communist. Then the movement declined to a trickle. The Haganah people were afraid that there would be violence, and they tended to concentrate those people more into Romania and took them out of Constanza rather than down to Italy. And other people began to go to Italy instead. Then I moved into North Bavaria. My headquarters were in Regensburg. And just before Rosh Hashanah 1945, I moved into Germany. And Klausner had already organized the Central Committee, and he was moving. And since he had no military assignment at all, he was lost as far as the military was concerned, and he stayed lost for 8 or 9 months, which was very useful to the Jews, I gotta tell you. A bunch of us met in Munich to decide what we could do that was useful. Bunch of chaplains.
Cool.
Oy vey Izmir. Klausner was the head of it. There was no question about that. I remember Max Wall, who's now in Burlington, Vermont, was there. One of the Cohens, I can't keep the Cohens straight. Mike Maraminsky was there. There was Gene Cohen, who was stationed in Austria. He was there. The guy who died, Marcus. Robert Marcus was there. He was an Air Force chaplain. The names are fading. I can't tell you who all was there. But there's some of these guys. And the most important thing we felt that we could do was established two linkages between the displaced persons and Jews around the world. One was mail and the other was packages. Our people didn't have clothes. UNRWA didn't have clothing. And for Jews to be walking around the streets of Munich in Dachau uniforms was not a very good idea, 6 months after liberation.
Okay,
Yeah.
just stop you for a second.
Yeah.
Do you think that the JDC should have sent clothing through JWB who had access to?
I can't answer that. That's an institutional question.
Okay.
If they could have arranged it, they damn well should have arranged it.
Okay.
But I can't say to you naively, I'm sure they tried. I don't know whether they tried or not. The attitude I got in Paris was the hell with it. We're going to go through channels, and when the channels say that we can bring stuff in, we'll bring stuff in. I have a nasty impression of the Paris office. They were enjoying themselves very, very much. And they knew nothing about Germany. They knew nothing about what a displaced person camp looked like. They weren't even hearing their own people. In November of '45, when I went to Paris to scream my head off, I had messages from Eli Rock and Seal and the other people in Munich, and the Paris office paid no attention to it. But that's the way it was. I don't know anything about the Geneva office of JDC. It could have been altogether different because Packy Schwartz was in Geneva then. But I dealt with the Paris office and got nowhere. So we decided, hell with it, we get our own packages. So we sent an appeal to everybody we knew before Rosh Hashanah to send 11-pound packages to us as chaplains. And we got them. We got tons. I had 80 people, displaced persons, working full-time in a warehouse in Regensburg, just receiving this stuff, sorting it, cleaning it, sewing it. And every week, I visited all 31 of the camps and communities, carrying sacks of packages, clothing, and sacks of mail.
The Army didn't bother you about
They
this?
couldn't, because it was all addressed to me.
I understand, but Rabbi Wall ran into some difficulty.
Wall ran into a hell of a difficulty. I don't remember why. I got into difficulty later because I set up contacts with other people. I used the World Jewish Congress office in London to distribute mail in the United Kingdom. I made contact with a buddy of mine in China to distribute mail in Shanghai. Al Fine was in China, and a classmate of mine, a marvelous guy. And what else was I? Eugene. Eventually, we used HIAS in New York and United Service for New Americans to distribute American stuff. It just got too heavy. My assistant and I could no longer rewrite all these envelopes, which is what we had to do. I had to put my frank in all the envelopes going out. The incoming mail was easier.
And the Army didn't bother you about all this?
I was in a division headquarters, and my assistant and I made friends with the people in the postal unit. What we did was take our truck and go down to the regional post office to pick up this stuff.
You had a truck?
Of course I had a truck. How can you operate without a truck? I had a truck. There were lots of trucks around. They were German trucks.
Oh.
So we had a truck. Getting gasoline sometimes got sticky. We had to steal it. But the truck itself was no problem, and cyanide drove. My own assigned vehicle, for reasons known only to the Army, was not a Jeep at that point. It was a command car. And it could handle some of this stuff, too. So we had lots of transport, and we were able to get the mail picked up, not through the normal unit post office. That would have been a burden. We picked it up where it was on bulk. And they didn't quite understand what the hell was going on. I got all his mail, but what did they care? They weren't asking any questions at the postal thing, except one fine day, and this was much later, on a plane going to England. There was a storm, and some mail sacks broke loose. And one of my boxes addressed to the World Jewish Congress in London opened. And all of this mail addressed to people in England was all over this airplane. About 6 months later, I was called into my commanding general in a different unit by the time all this paper caught up with me, and given a formal reprimand for having misused the mails. It's important to note that a displaced person could not send a letter. It wasn't legal until way into 1946 sometime, when a mail service was worked out through the JDC. And then we didn't have to do this anymore. But for almost a year, the only way a Jew in Germany could find out if his relatives in America were alive was through this illegal chaplain mail service. I can't tell you how many of us ran it. I would assume that most of the 90 guys did some of it. And we were very careful not to meet. We were very careful to go to Munich only one or two at a time, so that the CID was not going to catch up with us. That's all. We weren't going to get into trouble. I saw Abe Klausner once a week or so, just because he was in Munich and I was in North Bavaria, and we had a lot of business to do. And but we did not hold a lot of meetings. There was one meeting with JWB
Excuse me, we
Yeah.
finished with this other meeting before Rosh
Yeah,
Hashanah?
this was set up, the thing worked, we did mail, we
And you
did
didn't know?
packages.
That was it?
That was it. And we made no attempt to coordinate. I wrote to everybody I knew. And I kept writing.
So it wasn't really just a spontaneous thing that each chaplain saw that...
No, there was a meeting.
It was a
This
meeting.
was organized.
I see. That's the
Many
impression I
months
had.
later, into 1946, I don't remember what month, Aryalev came into Germany and had a meeting with chaplains, and Luckstein was with him. And they got us in a room in Munich, in a hotel room, and said, okay, boys, the army business is taken care of. Now tell us what's going on, and what can JWB do to help? We know you're up to something. We're glad. We don't know officially, but talk to us. We didn't very much. Didn't need it. There was nothing JWB could do for us. Our job was to get Jews out of Germany by then. By then, JDC had begun to bring supplies in. Casks of marmalade. And good things, necessary things. They used North Africa as their source of supply. Passover of 1946 was supplied out of North Africa. You could get fresh oranges in Morocco. All you had to do was fly down there, buy the damn things, and ship them up. It was easy. So once they got going, they did fine. They had money. They took care of supplies. We got out of the supply business by the spring of '46. And the only important thing then was getting Jews out. And here the Army intervened. The Ben Gurion-Eisenhower conversations were very important. Have you interviewed Simon Rifkin?
Nothing.
Put it down. You got it. He's an attorney in New York, and he was Eisenhower's advisor on Jewish affairs. He played a key role in this because he was so damn respectable, and therefore got away with murder.
So that's not known.
I think it's known that he did the negotiating with Eisenhower and Ben Gurion. He was in the room. It was Rifkin who called me on the telephone in Ruth Kluger's office in Paris to send me to Palestine. Not much secret about that. He doesn't talk about it much because he's a nice, quiet guy who doesn't toot his horn. And besides, Weiss Paul Rifkin is a rather busy law firm in New York, and he's its senior partner. But Judge Rifkin is an extraordinary fellow, and his role in this was key. He kept Eisenhower on our side. He kept McNarney on our side at first, and then Phil Bernstein came in. And if you haven't interviewed Phil, you should interview him too. Phil's not as modest, but that's because he's a rabbi. But he did a thorough good job. Where do we move? What should be the next? Out of these conversations, in the spring of 1946,
Between Ben Gurion and...
well, not directly, but
Yeah.
once this thing got moving, I guess directly because of Hoffman and General Mickelson, who was the G5, the civil affairs officer in McNarney's headquarters. Eisenhower had left by this time. McNarney was the commanding general. Came a need for a liaison officer between the Jewish agency and the American army, it being understood that the Jewish agency was running the Bricha. And Mickelson understood this. And he and Hoffman negotiated having me made into a civilian, working for the Jewish agency to do that job. And I was in fact civilianized. My senior chaplain in the theater, a Catholic named Tiernan, who hated my guts, punished me by sending me home. So that I couldn't make the transition in Europe. I had to
go
come
back
home.
and then,
My wife and son were supposed to come over, and I had to come and get them instead of having them come over. And it took 6 months to get the papers. He really screwed us real good. But meanwhile, so I raised money for Haganah in the United States during those 6 months, and was generally useful. That's that campaign that's written up in Slater's The Pledge. In February of '47, I came back as a civilian, stationed in Heidelberg, because it was a convenient place, and there wasn't a big headquarters there. In Frankfurt, I would have been too conspicuous. In Munich, I would have been too conspicuous, because they were watching the Jews in Munich.
Who was watching?
The CIC, counterintelligence, because after all, they didn't all know that the commanding general up in Frankfurt had a deal. And some of them were very zealous to be law-abiding. I have seen memos, illegal transport of Jews scheduled out on such and such a night. So we had to go on a different night.
Didn't they realize that the brass was
No.
allowing this?
No. I knew a Jewish CIC man who had absolutely no information.
But didn't they see that they were making these memos and then sending them on ahead, and nobody did anything about it?
Well, they did things. They would change the patrol schedule in the woods. General Mickelson knew what he was doing, but he couldn't send orders down, let the Jews alone.
Mm-hmm. No, but
He
didn't
handled it at his end.
the CIC realize that this was going on?
Hard to tell. I can only tell you that the CIC guys in Ulm didn't know,
Okay.
because they stopped us one night. And we had a hell of a time getting through, but this was late. My job was to keep the army out of the Haganah's hair and the Haganah out of the army's hair. That was my liaison job between General Mickelson's office and Chaim Hoffman in Munich. I was in Heidelberg because there was another job to do. We were beginning to collect arms in quantity rather than just in types. We had gotten the things that we had needed very early on in types. I got an order one day to steal a bazooka. So we stole a bazooka and sent a bazooka to such and such a place, from which it apparently went to such and such a place, and apparently got on to Palestine, where they did manufacture bazookas. Eventually, they wanted quantity of arms, though, as well as prototypes. And there was a special group, about which I knew absolutely nothing, I can't even tell you who was running it, that collected arms. My role in that was for this part of Germany to use my cellar to store the stuff until a truck would back up at my house in the middle of the night and take it away. That's all I know about it.
To this day, you don't know it.
I mean, not the Vegas notion. I reported to Munich that I had catacombs in the cellar of my house in Heidelberg. There were 7 big cellars down there where they used to store food in the winter. Cold and stuff, fridges of God knows what. And they put arms down there. They'd run them in, they'd run them out. I had nothing to do with it. They ran people in and out too. We took a big house with 4 extra bedrooms on the 3rd floor where the Haganah people could spend a night, and displaced persons moving from here to there could spend a night and things like that. So we ran a hotel, among other things. Mostly, though, during that period, we ran transports. Ulm was our starting point. Mulhouse in France was our ending point. Ephraim Frank, a kibbutznik from Givat Chaim, was my partner and my boss. And that's what we did. I did that for 6 months, employed by the Jewish Agency. Then the Preparatory Commission of the International Refugee Organization wanted to get into this act because Paul Edwards, an American who's with the UN now, liked it. It excited him, and he wanted to help. So Max Browdy and I both went to work for IRO. He is some kind of administrative officer. I forget what the hell he was supposed to be doing that he wasn't doing. And I is an immigration officer, at which I didn't work very hard for 6 months. And we kept on doing what we were doing.
How many people would you say passed through your...
I don't know. For me personally?
Yeah.
No. Not the funniest. Couldn't begin to guess. The largest single group was the group that went on the Exodus 1947. Those people went out of Germany in 5 transports, 2 by train and 3 by truck. I took all 3 truck ones. We took 3 transports in 8 nights. The trucks.
Exactly what were you doing during this time if you weren't an immigration officer?
I was running transports out of Germany.
Exactly. I mean,
And they had to be organized. What did it mean?
Jesus, it's hard to tell you how the days were spent.
It really is. Much of the time we were sitting and waiting. My home in Heidelberg was the place from which the orders came from Paris, in Hebrew code. Ephraim Deckel and Shaul Avigur in Geneva and Paris were running things. And we got our orders from them. You know, there are X-teen places on a ship. Get people there by such and such a date. Our people all went to the Marseille. And from Mulhouse to Marseille we had trains, French trains.
Yeah, I heard something about boats, illegal boats. Was that?
Yeah.
Were you involved in that also?
Well, all of these people got on illegal boats.
No, I mean.
In buying them, you mean?
No, not. There was a motorboats. I heard that.
On what body of water?
I heard something.
I had nothing to do with motorboats. I was in landlocked Germany.
No, from Marseille.
I've been in Marseille once in my life.
Oh, okay.
I never got it. My work ended at Mulhouse. Once we had crossed the Rhine, And taking those people to Mulhouse, we were finished. We went back home again to do it again.
And who picked it up? Who picked it up?
The
from
French heaven. There was an operation out of Paris.
Mhm.
My wife and I have very warm memories of some of them. My wife had kind of a yen for a Jewish medical student named Bernard, who always met us in Mulhouse. They became kissing kin. And my wife was my transport nurse, though she's not a nurse. She went on many of these transports with me. Because somebody had to be able to take care of a baby. And one night deliver one. So once we got to Mulhouse, we were finished. We went back into Germany. We used Ulm as our starting point because we owned some barracks there that we were able to use. The days were pretty dull, by and large, waiting for the telephone call from Paris, and then it got very frantic. Quotas had to be distributed, we'd have meetings in Munich, and then show up, always on Saturday, at this barracks and get our people ready, drive through the night to the picnic ground where we rested in the morning, and then went on to be at Pont de Sèze at precisely the right time when our friend would be on the French border patrol and would know we had fake papers but would accept them as real. That's how it worked. What else did I do during that time? I was the PR man for the Bricha in Heidelberg and in the Frankfurt area. It was my job to seduce American journalists. And, you might want to interview Dick Dudman here in town if you have time. Do you know him?
No.
He's the head of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch office in Washington. Richard Dudman, very distinguished journalist. D-U-D-M-A-N, he's not Jewish. But I.F. Stone sent him to Germany.
Now, Dudman, I'm sorry, again, is what? He was...
St. Louis Post-Dispatch.
St. Louis.
He was then with the Denver Post. And he came into Germany, knocked on my door one day and said, I want to go on a DP transport. And I said, so go find yourself a DP transport. What do I know about DP transports? And he said I must have goofed. And I said, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't even know who you are. He said, Izzy Stone sent me. I never heard of Izzy Stone. And so what we did was, he saw to it that Izzy sent me a cable with the proper words in it. And then we put Dick Dudman in DP clothes, gave him a DP identity card, and we sent him on an illegal transport. He landed on Cyprus. And he wrote a series of 7 or 8 articles about that were sensational.
Where they appear?
In the Denver Post. And they were syndicated from the Denver Post. That was in 1947. And
You think it would be worthwhile speaking to him?
Dick, yeah, it might be fun. He's a marvelous fellow. And he may know things about how all that happened that I don't know. I've never asked him very much. He did it because he was engaged to a Jewish girl who he married. And they're still living together. So, all kinds of stuff like this. I was in Paris once for a meeting, and some American journalist wanted to meet one of the big shots of the Haganah. So we pulled the typical trip. I picked him up in his hotel, and we got into a cab, and we got out, we got into another cab, and we got into a third cab. We ended up in a little corner bar, and there sitting in the corner was Colonel Wolf, Ephraim Frank. And Colonel Wolf interviewed him, this kind of stuff. Sounds silly, except it was the only way to do it. And so we got excellent publicity in the American press during this time, and that was part of my job. That took up more time, actually, than the transports, because most of the transport time was wait for them. Meanwhile, of course, I had to travel around to the camps and talk to the Palestinians and to NDPs. Yeah.
Did you find it more difficult than not being a chaplain?
Yes, it was much more difficult not being a chaplain. I regretted many times not having done what Klausner did. Klausner went back into the chaplaincy and spent more time in Germany. Being a chaplain has its advantages. You're really much freer. Being a civilian, the military do not like civilians. And dealing with the military was very difficult, except for General Mickelson, who was an angel. I never had a minute's trouble with him. But dealing with military people is difficult for a civilian. Okay, what else you want to know?
Now, do you have anything else to tell me about your work within the camps?
During the German period, that's late 45, 46,
Yeah.
when I got back to Regensburg from Czechoslovakia, there were all kinds of problems in the camps that we had to deal with. This wasn't just a case of coming in, picking up the mail, and delivering mail or packages. There was the actual organization of the camps. I was the only rabbi in North Bavaria. I had to get more help. I just couldn't handle weddings, for example. One of the sidelights to history is that by the late fall of 1945, the marriage rate among Jewish displaced persons went zooming. And by the beginning of 1947, so did the birth rate. And they couldn't be married civilly, they had to have a rabbi. So we had a civilian rabbi, whom you ought to meet, by the way. He's in New York, too.
Yeah.
There's a guy on Long Island named Joseph Glatzer, Glatzer. Darned if I know where you're going to find him. He's a rather elusive fellow who has never recovered from the fact that once he got to the United States, they wouldn't let him be a rabbi, because he wasn't really a rabbi. But the military government and I accepted him as a rabbi because we needed a rabbi. And he became the civilian rabbi in Regensburg to do all kinds of chores. He's worth interviewing, though, if he can remember what went on then. So he stayed in Regensburg, where we had 2,000 Jews. He had enough to do. I traveled these 31 camps and communities, camp organization, meeting with the camp committees. What do you do with the Orthodox Jews who insist on having a mikveh? I can't build a mikveh in the middle of a DP camp. These problems were real problems, and they were constant, and they had to be dealt with. I was deeply unhappy the whole time at the amount of power I had. I represented power. And I have since, one of the powerful effects on me in my lifetime has been to avoid power. There's a terrible feeling, this power, like to be God Almighty to these people. You know, I could decide who would come and who would go, who would stay and who would leave. That took a great deal of time, just traveling to these places. Every camp had unique problems. Then there were a lot of meetings that took place. So that, I don't know what you'd call the kind of a job that Cy Pava and I did. There's another name for you. Simon Pava, P-A-V-A. He's a social worker in Hartford, Connecticut. I don't think I have a current address for him. We've been out of touch for many years. He was a sergeant in the United States Army and was my assistant. You know, chaplain's entitled to one assistant. And Cy was it for a long, long time. The DPs called him Shimon HaTzadik, and he was. He was a real tzaddik. Lovely, lovely. He was a kid. He was 19 years old. Scared out of his mind for just the size of the problem. But could he work? He was absolutely great. So that we ran around, just doing all these nutty jobs.
Can we be more specific aside from that? I mean, everything that you did.
Wow, hard.
In other words, you were the only contact they had with the Jewish people.
I was their contact with the outside world until the Palestinians came in.
Which was?
The first Palestinians came in late November 1945. And then gradually, as more Palestinians came in, they became the contact with the Jewish people.
But then what was your role as chaplain?
By then, see, something specific happened to me, which I guess has to be mentioned. I took these 2 trips to Palestine in November 45 to organize and to bring Chaim and the guys into Germany. Once I had done that, my role changed, because simultaneously another guy you ought to meet, named Joseph Levine, who lives in Indiana.
Yeah.
My secretary will give you his address. We have a very specific address for Joe. Fort Wayne is his town. I'm sorry. He's now retired. He's the executive of the Indiana Jewish Historical Society. He was head of the Jewish Federation of Fort Wayne for many, many years. Joe came in with the JDC in November, precisely, of 1945. And he gradually took over practically all of my duties in North Bavaria, because he was willing. Great, great guy. He hated the JDC in Paris as much as I did, and he wanted to know until he began to get supplies, and then he knew what to do with them. Meanwhile, he had my supplies. He had my warehouse. He had the stuff coming in. He just took over. He took over. He ran the mail service. He ran the package service, and he went to the camps and communities. Because once I got back from Palestine, I got stuck with this Frankfurt business of helping set up Here are these Palestinians coming in. What are you going to do? There's the brichat to run. How do you get people out? How do you organize this and that? There's old General Mickelson sitting up there in Frankfurt, who's a military man after all, and only talks English. So that I spent more and more time with him. And then I got transferred. Because Chaplain Tiernan got very angry at me because I wasn't doing my job. He saw me in Frankfurt too often. I wasn't doing my job with the 4th Armored Division, so I got kicked out of the 4th Armored Division and moved to the 9th Division in Augsburg. And that's it's a vignette. You may or may not want to record it. It's an interesting sidelight. He decided to exile me to Berlin. I'll send you so goddamn far away you'll never see another Jewish displaced person, said he. And I said, yes, sir, because Berlin was perfect for me. The movement out of the Soviet Union was just starting, that swing through Berlin. 250,000 Jews were going to be coming through Berlin in no time at all, and Joe Liebstein was up there all by himself, a Palestinian. Nothing could have been better from my standpoint, so I said, yes, sir. And then he found that out, too. And so he didn't transfer me to Berlin, he transferred me to Augsburg, and by one of the interesting historic fates, the chaplain of the 9th Division, who had been there all of about 4 weeks, was one Herbert Friedman, who had just arrived from the States. So I went to Augsburg, and Herb went to Berlin, and his career was on its way, and Herb and I laugh about it every time we meet, because he was angry at me. When I went to Augsburg to replace him, he thought I had manipulated it. He was furious at me, because Augsburg's only 15 minutes from Munich, and he was getting acquainted with all the Munich people, and he was going to be able to do what he really wanted to do. And here this bastard comes in, who's replacing him, and he has to go to Berlin. I said to him, Herb, go to Berlin, go ahead. And gave him one telephone number of Joe, and then he knew what to do. So I was in Augsburg for a couple of months, working out of Munich, of course, so that there was no big deal. But I did not do much work directly then, except in Augsburg, where I had a very interesting local problem. There were 2 groups of Jews in Augsburg. German Jews, Augsburg Jews, 3rd, 4th, 10th generation German Jews.
What were they doing during
They were in Theresienstadt, and they came back. They came back by way of Deggendorf, where I had brought them from Theresienstadt. I talked about Theresienstadt, maybe we should. And then there were the East European Jews. They didn't talk to each other. There were 2 committees, there were 2 groups, and I couldn't stand it. I was very young and very intolerant. So I called the leaders of the 2 groups together and said, I got bad news for you people. Pesach's coming. And I will control Pesach supplies. You want to make Pesach this year? I want 1 committee to deal with. I won't deal with 2. And one night we had a love meeting at which I presided in German and Yiddish simultaneously, at which they organized the United Jewish Community of Augsburg, which was absolutely paper. You know, they never talked to each other then or later, but they got their Pesach supplies, and I was content because I was young and idealistic in those days. It was a pretty dumb waste of time, but I was 25 years old, for crying out loud. What did I know about 300-year-old hatreds? I wasn't going to have any of them. So that's what I did in Augsburg, in the local community, and just look after Jews who came and went and worry about them. And then I came home to be civilianized. So that was the end of that period in Augsburg, my God.
But nothing special?
No, nothing spectacular, because it was during that period that more Palestinians were coming in. I was working with Chaim in Munich. I spent a great deal of time, in Munich. He was still Hoffman. And getting the office organized, getting the people organized, getting the structure, because it was clear that I was going to become a civilian. That was already agreed to. And so I was really starting to take on the various things that I would be doing. And then I left. Let's go back in time and talk about Theresienstadt just a little bit. It's not very important in the scheme of things, except sentimentally it's very important to me. When I got to Pilsen, I learned for the first time that there was a place called Theresienstadt. One of the things that bothers the hell out of me, by the way, is that we in American Jewish life knew very little during the war. I don't understand that.
It's not true.
That we knew very little? We knew very little.
We knew very lot. I wrote my MA thesis on that. My MA thesis was the analysis of the response of American Jewry to the Holocaust from 1939 to 43 as reflected in the press, meaning American press and
what did you
press.
find besides Dachau Buchenwald, Majdanek, maybe by 43, Treblinka had come into
Well,
the news.
Theresienstadt, if I
and
remember
Auschwitz.
correctly, was a very popular camp because that's where there was a show camp,
That was the show camp.
which everyone should have known about because that was where the Red Cross was taken.
That's right. But we didn't know about Theresienstadt.
Well, I can't promise you that
didn't know
Theresienstadt was known.
No,
But
there were
but
lots
we
of
knew-
places that weren't known.
Oh, okay. You mean, in other words, of...
We didn't know, the Holocaust we knew of.
Oh, okay, fine.
Of
okay,
course.
Okay.
We knew it before we were supposed to know it. It was supposed to have really come bursting forth in 43. We knew before 43.
Long before.
Long. But there are a lot of details we didn't know, and I had not heard of Theresienstadt. And I'm not an innocent, but I did not know of Theresienstadt. I learned of Theresienstadt from Sylvia, who said I could go there, and that somebody ought to. She knew there were Jews there. Boy, were there Jews there. There were still 20,000 Jews there when I got there with the Russians. Another sidelight on history, the commander of the Russian unit at Theresienstadt, which was helping to dismantle the camp and move these people where they were going, was Jewish. How do I know it? We talked German to each other. And my antenna began to percolate a little bit, and I said to myself, that's a Jew, that major. And so I deliberately threw in some words which only could be Yiddish because they were Hebrew. And he responded and did not throw in one of them, but he responded. He was brilliant. We had conversations which were funny because we both knew what we were doing. He was never alone. The political man was always sitting next to him. We never had a conversation alone. And I never saw him again. And but he was willing for the camp to be emptied. That was his job. He had no objection to people coming into the American zone of Germany. The Deggendorf camp had been designated for people from Theresienstadt, and so we emptied it. We moved American trucks
This was
in.
illegal. This was
No,
legal.
legal. This was legal.
Legal.
This was from Czechoslovakia, the American zone of Germany. That was perfectly legal, but it had to be done. And
Even though the Americans didn't want more of the peace.
the Americans had accepted this. These were German Jews. Presumably, you see, they were going to scatter neatly. They weren't going to be on the Americans' hands. Actually, what turned out is that they stayed in Deggendorf until the Stratton Bill was passed, and then most of them came to the United States. That was a smooth operation. We didn't have any big troubles with that. It operated. But every time I went to Theresienstadt, they gave me the opportunity to go to Prague, where there were 6,000 Jews backed up in the Rothschild Hospital. And it was from there that we drew our people to come into the American zone by train to go to Austria, to go to Italy. And that was very important. Theresienstadt had a double importance for me. It has since become such an important symbol. I didn't think of it as such an important symbol then. It's gotten more important over the years. For me, the important symbol was Dachau. If you have to take your shocks, one of the two greatest shocks I've had in my life was Dachau. And that transformed me. It fortunately happened very early. When I got to Germany, I'm through with Theresienstadt, by the way. When I first got to Germany, I didn't have an assignment. Many of us didn't. We were pooled into Germany. And I was free to wander around for a short time, awaiting assignment. And one of the first places I went was Dachau. Partly because Max Braudy was in Augsburg, which is very near Dachau, and I heard a rumor that Abe was down there. And by God, he was. And Abe showed me around Dachau. And I'm glad it happened early. I'm not sure I would have done the nutty things that all of us did if I hadn't had that shock. Because I'm not a crazy guy. And to do crazy things. Klosner's a crazy guy. Klosner likes doing crazy things. He likes turning over apple carts and upsetting doors. That's not who I am. I'm something of a maverick, but I'd get that cop. It's not my way. Or at least it wasn't 25 years ago. But Dachau did it to me. And from then on, it was just a case of, boy, what needs doing, let's do it. And the heck with everybody. Someday, I confidently predict, I'm going to get a bill from the United States Army for $1 jillion on memorandum receipts that I signed. Perfectly straight memorandum receipts for all kinds of material that we needed for our work. And if it was available in a warehouse and they'd give it to me on MR, I signed for it.
Well, why would they give it to you?
If I want a typewriter, I need a typewriter. So I go to 10 different warehouses and get 10 typewriters and give me copies. And the earlier it happened, the easier it was to get things signed on MR. I guess one of the things that ought to be said is that in April and May of 1945, and June and July too, we were in great chaos. The American army was not ready for the end of the war. You don't run a war to end it. You run a war on the assumption it's going to keep on going. And you bring in your material and you set up your systems for the war to go on. All of a sudden the damn war ended on them, and they didn't know what to do. So that they just don't reverse into peacetime army status. There was great confusion, enormous confusion, and we could take advantage of that. Abe stole 38,000 pairs of shoes one night because somebody wasn't thinking.
Were you involved in that?
No, that was his operation. I had nothing to do with it. Abe didn't need help.
What did you steal?
Whatever was stealable. I started out in the Rhineland before I went to Czechoslovakia stealing food because our people didn't have food. In the beginning of this thing, the early spring, summer 45, I guess this ought to be said, if you didn't live in a camp, you didn't get UNRWA help because they didn't have staff to take care of urban people. We had very little. I was stationed near Cologne. I was up in the Rhineland. That was my first assignment. I was only there about 6 weeks, but those were a crucial 6 weeks. The Buchenwald people were coming out. And what the hell do you do with them?
Did you work with Rabbi Schachter at all, man? Or,
No.
Marcus?
Marcus, yes.
Okay.
But work is a funny word. You know, we met and said, you do this and I'll do that.
Mm-hmm.
And Bob was very worried about that point about transporting kids out. He was busy organizing his kids' transports. And that was his thing, and he didn't need any help on it. I had to worry about this trickle of Jews. There weren't thousands of them coming into Cologne. They had a right to be housed. How did you get military government to give displaced Jews? And by the way, there was no category of displaced person called Jew. That was a tremendous, tremendous headache for us until about
You think
July.
that was a mistake in the American Jewish community?
No, it was a mistake of the American Army and UNRWA.
No, but I mean, did the American Jewish community do anything to in other words,
Oh,
shouldn't they-
sure.
Shouldn't they have done something about
They
it?
did.
Okay.
Oh, they did, as rapidly as possible. I sent letters through channels to Eisenhower. Other chaplains did the same. We cabled to the guys, after all, Lipman was running UNRWA at that point, and he understood these chachmas. It's just, it took time for this stuff to percolate through. I guess it was around June 15th before Eisenhower issued the order that created the category of Jewish displaced person and gave us the right to open displaced person camps for Jews. By which time there already were displaced persons camps for Jews because Abe had set them up, all by himself. When he decided that nobody should be living in Dachau, and he took the people out of Dachau to St. Attilian and the places that he took them. But he operated his way down there because he was free to do so. In Cologne, we had a tough time getting housing for Jews, and we couldn't get food for them. We couldn't get under rations. And as it happens, near Cologne, for the Rhineland campaign, which was a very important series of battles, we had enormous stores of food, army stores.
Mm-hmm.
So I got my American soldiers who were willing. All the guys who came to shul, I decided were Jewish enough that I could trust them. And I opened up with them one night and said, all I can do for you is tell you where to take this stuff. If you ever quote me, I'll slit your throats. We need food. We need a lot of food. And here's the place. And I used my command car, and every night we went out stealing food. It wasn't hard to do. Goddamn depots were huge, and they weren't adequately guarded. Who cared about K-rations long about then? The answer is Jews cared about K-rations. They saved Jewish lives, K-rations.
But
and
you couldn't go
C-rations.
to the army and ask for them?
No, because that's UNRWA's business. The army has a very simple system. What's our business is our business.
What's our
Chaplain,
business?
go to UNRWA. We got UNRWA. So, that's how that operated during the time I was in the Rhineland. Mostly food. I can't think of anything else I had to steal then. Czechoslovakia, we got into the liquor business, as I have told you. And from then on, it was anything that was stealable. For Yom Kippur of 1945. Do you care about non-world shaking but emotionally important little things? Talk about Yom Kippur 1945. I decided that the 2,000 Jews of Regensburg were entitled to...
I think we better just turn on here.